but people don't always associate value with emotional connection. So when you can make that happen, and it just kind of is like 2 + 2 = 5.
That's Shannon Deep. She and her co-founder Kevan Lee run Bonfire, a brand storytelling agency for high-growth startups. Together, they're breathing life into multi-million and billion-dollar brands, helping them find their voice and tell unique stories that are impossible to ignore. They're giving brands permission to get creative in how they tell their story and teaching them how to get buy-in and scale creativity across multiple stakeholders and different teams.
We want to be brand shepherds, not brand police with it. And the idea with shepherds, you're kind of just corralling and pointing people in the right direction rather than nitpicking.
In our conversation, we discuss the 4 different narratives that make up a brand story, how to roll out a brand to multiple stakeholders, and things to consider when you're about to rebrand. I'm Tommy Walker, my guests are Kevan Lee and Shannon Deep, and this is The Cutting Room. Shannon, Kevan, tell me about your content marketing philosophy and how has it evolved over time?
I typically think of a couple of different buckets. I think of a content marketing philosophy and I think of an editorial content philosophy. And then both of those things kind of roll up into the overall brand philosophy that you might have as a company. And so at a high level, like content marketing is about like, let's sell some stuff. Editorial content is more about let's make you feel things. And so both things seem really valuable and important and are part of the mix overall of how you go to market and how you talk to your audience. But they serve different purposes within the overall structure of your brand and your strategy of how you're trying to get your message out and communicate it to folks. And so a lot of the work that Shannon and I do trends a bit more toward the editorial side of things. I think there's definitely a content marketing piece in there as well. But the how you feel bit, I think is my philosophy is that is equally as important as what is your keyword approach, what is your like CTA conversion rates on your content on your blog, like what is the editorial piece as well, like how do you get people to feel these things, how do you build up top of funnel awareness, how do you build association and affinity for the brand that you're growing.
How do you
Yeah,
build
I also think
association and affinity with the brand?
So I was going to say, I think your content marketing team is kind of your brand team's best friend in a big way, because they act as the mouthpieces of the organization. And I think that a strong relationship between your brand team and your brand marketers and your content marketing team, whether they're kind of more, straight up and down content marketing or editorial PR comms professionals, I think doing that and showing the content marketing team and collaborating with them on brand-led initiatives can really just widen the aperture and broaden the opportunities for expressing your brand, even in something that you might think is like a really kind of niche touch point or something that's like very, very specialized or down funnel as like a piece of content marketing or demand gen. Like it still can have this brand bent.
I think what's interesting about the whole, like, I've worked on branded content teams, right? I've worked with, and people don't know where content sits in a lot of cases. And I think what's interesting, you were both kind of touching on this, is that content is usually one of the most frequently published arms of the company. And it's one of these opportunities where you can show that personality a lot more and a lot more frequently. In that regard, I'm really interested to hear your take on not just communicating that with a content team, but how are you communicating brand across the board with different types of different teams?
You have to make it useful for people or it's going to fall by the wayside. And so if you think that you're going to have brand guidelines and they're going to be, high level kind of brand at a glance stuff or something that like your design team would take and use, and you give that to your like CX team or any other like customer facing team at your organization, and you expect them to be able to like take that and run with it, I think that's a little bit naive. And there is another step of distillation or translation, working with those stakeholders to really understand what does their day-to-day look like? Where are the opportunities that brand could infiltrate like into their daily workflows? And when you understand that, then you can be really thoughtful about the types of tools that you give to people. I think a lot of communicators, whether they're internal communicators or external communicators at the company, can use Some need just like a one sheeter or something, or words to use, words to avoid, like that kind of stuff can be like really tactical and really helpful. And other people want to be inspired, like maybe employer branding professionals want to be inspired more on the kind of macro level for like how they think about how that goes in their work. So I think it's really about like understanding the stakeholders first and foremost.
Yeah, and I think of it somewhat with the idea of containers. And so what containers can you give folks so they can understand like how does my work fit into this container or this container? One of the ways that Shannon and I like to do that is through coming up with 3 to 5 different stories that are really key and central to your brand overall. And those stories can then drive, if you think of them as like swim lanes within your content strategy, or if you think of them as campaigns within your performance strategy, like maybe you have one around the category you're building, one around your persona, one around the product itself. And then these stories become containers in which you can say, oh, great, this thing I want to express to my audience through this ad or through this campaign or through this webinar or through this event, it can fit within this story so that it's not just this random thing that doesn't really make sense with the brand. It's like on voice, on tone, it's on track with like everything else that we're saying. And so giving folks those like clear definitions of it's okay to play in this area. And then to Shannon's point, like there's room to explore and express yourself in different ways, depending on your role, depending on your channel and things like that. But it's still like all ladders up to this overall brand narrative and architecture that you're trying to communicate.
Let's rewind back for a second here. Tell me about how you're finding those stories.
I think that like there are a couple key areas that we mine for stories. It's your company's history, it's your brand purpose, it's your company mission, and your brand values. And you might not have all of those pieces like perfectly articulated all the time, but that's generally like where we kind of look to start. And the really fruitful area for distilling those stories is where do those things overlap? So where does your mission overlap with your values? Where does your brand purpose overlap with like why the company was founded in the first place? The founder story maybe is like going to be, it all depends on who you're speaking to, what you're selling, what your business goals are, which of those are more relevant. But generally speaking, that's where you kind of start to look, because those in general are a great starting place, but you can't just sort of like chuck a brand purpose over the fence to marketing and be like, okay, now go make stories out of it. Right. There needs to be like another level of analysis and kind of creation there. And so like Kevan was saying, we tend to take those as inputs, and then we think about a category story, a product story, a persona story, and like a cultural story sometimes too, if it's relevant. And you could kind of like, it's like taking, like meshing them together and seeing like where the juicy points are.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind when I was working at Buffer, I was probably writing more content than I needed to write, but it was like, we had a production line moving there. And so writing, 4 or 5 posts a week on these big topics. And I think one of the things that was really important and like central to the cohesiveness of the brand and the content strategy was going back to these foundations of like, why does Buffer exist as a social media management platform? When you had things like Hootsuite, you had things like Sprout Social, like really big players in the space. One of the reasons we existed is for this idea of freedom and flexibility for your life. You can kind of build content into Buffer and go about your day and know that it's going to be taken care of. There's that aspect of freedom. There's an aspect of like simplicity and utility. And like there's platforms with tons of features, but Buffer is a bit more refined. Then there was this cultural identity of like, we don't know what we're doing, which is great for me because I had no idea what I was doing with social media. And so just embracing that from like a company culture perspective and then taking that into content, being like, cool, I'm going to write about all these things I have no idea about on Twitter. And those are going to be like my next 10 blog posts. Is all these things I'm learning and approaching it from that like voice and tone, even of just being curious and open and not feeling like I have the answers. And so that kind of all those inputs informed a content strategy that then we could go and take to market in that way.
Yeah, I just think that what Kevan is kind of touching on too is like, how do you get to the thing that is most unique and differentiated with your brand as well? Yeah. And I think that you'll find like the more things that overlap, like an idea that you find in your company founding story, in your brand purpose, in your brand values, and in your mission, if like suddenly there's this nice alignment where this same idea is expressed in all of these places, then it's likely that idea is pretty unique to you, because that's a lot of things that have to overlap for like that to be true. And so knowing where those moments of uniqueness are. I know sometimes that like content is a kind of like you do want to say the same thing as other people, because that's like it's important to like get what your audience cares about in the same way that your competitors are. That's like a lot of SEO strategy, is like make sure that like you have the library and that you kind of have like the moat that like people come to. But also, especially when you're thinking about the more editorial side of things, you are looking for the thing that is different, that is going to cut through the noise, and that's going to make that connection with people.
That was a lot of my experience when I was at Shopify Plus, is that I had to answer that question of what is the difference between Shopify Plus and the rest of the enterprise e-commerce market, and more importantly, what's the difference between the enterprise division and the regular old division. And I think what's interesting about that, especially as it relates to content, is that when people are coming into your brand, right? Say you are, showing up in search, that's really your opportunity to, and I think Buffer did this really well. You show up in these same conversations and it's like, yes, this is how you do it, but this is how we think about doing it as a company. This is why you should think about it this way too. And I think that's what really starts to get the association going along. We're going to move on to the next section of the show. So you're working with a company, they've got a good product, they're starting to get a little bit of traction. What's your process from building brand from there, right? Tell me from the very beginning, ground up, what's step one?
You're too late already if you're already thinking about product market fit. No, I mean, I'm kind of joking, but also not joking. I think like part of it with the brand is like, why do you feel you need to exist in the first place? And ideally, you have an answer to that before you're even going out and building a product and searching for product market fit. And so oftentimes, we will get people who come into us and are at that point that you just described, Tommy, and it's like, oh, help us figure out our story now.
Yeah.
And we as marketers can come up with really compelling stories that are like retrofitted to what you've already done. I think the most powerful stories are ones that don't need that retrofitting, but that have been like birthed out of this very clearly defined and like clearly orchestrated reason for existing.
Mm-hmm.
Reason for existing, both like for you, maybe personally, like as your founder story, as a need you felt in the market. A reason for existing of like, there is something in the culture or the zeitgeist that is like screaming for this thing to exist in the world today. Like those are the most compelling brand stories. And so ideally, like how can we get to the heart of that with a founder or with a leadership team? Ideally that exists, but if not, you can always be creative with it too. But it really starts with that why piece. And I think the why piece you can and probably should know before you even get to the point of product market fit.
I think sometimes people don't know that they have the story already too. And I think that that's something that can come out of conversations with, not just branding professionals, but like marketers or writers or people who are trained to sort of like, it's like whenever there's a picture of like a tree stump and it's like there's a face in the tree stump, it's like some people might not see it, but then like if you have your like story eyes on, because that's what you do professionally and you're a creative person in that way, like you'll kind of be able to connect the dots and see. And so I think if you're a founder or if you're an exec who's like thinking about, oh, for the first time we need to define our story, like it might be there. You might just have to talk to the people around you and like see what emerges. And usually something does. And it isn't just, oh my gosh, we have to make up this thing and then kind of like slap it on like retrospectively.
What are your conversations looking like?
That's exactly some of the process, is just like talking a lot. So it's talking to founders, is talking to customers, is talking to early team members. It could be talking to investors if you're at that stage. Ideally, there was some story that made investors put money down. So lots of conversations around that. I think there is the very obvious question of like, why did you create this? Like, what is your story leading up to this point of realization that this thing needed to exist in the world? What is the vision for the product? Like, where do you see this headed long term? What is the customer impact that you have observed or are hoping to get to at some point as the product evolves? So it's trying to understand like the motivations and the rationale behind the decisions that were made to get the company to this stage, and then also like, where do you want to go long term? Because oftentimes you might find a disconnect there where the product is what it is today because that's the thing that people will pay money for or sign up for.
Yep.
But once you get that foundation, then you can kind of take it in the direction that you want. And sometimes the brand story is about how do you build that roadmap to get there so that all makes sense.
Yeah, ideally you're trying to ask questions that will get to some kind of feeling at the bottom of the answer, that something beyond, I did it to make money and because this product is useful. And so, which like, yes, that's the table stakes. So like, what else is there? And usually, almost always, there is something there beneath it. And so, yeah, driving at that, the emotional core of it will unlock, I think, the rest of the narrative usually.
That was definitely my experience when, because this is like being on the foundational level at Shopify, like this will be the thing that I will always draw on there. But it was like talking to the other employees, like you were saying, Kevin, like early employees, talking to customers, and yeah, learning what that core was for everybody. The question is, and I know how I've done this, but the question is how are you taking that core and starting to codify it to bring it across the organization and basically reflect back what everybody else was saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long process, usually. I mean, it depends on how big the team is. It depends on how aligned everybody is. And I think that that there is definitely an opportunity to, you don't have to say everything everywhere all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind is your story can come to life in kind of like fractional ways in different places across the funnel, across audiences, across channels as appropriate. And so I guess like, you know, you don't want to just have the fire hose approach to like telling your story everywhere all the time. And so, yeah, I think to get people on board and to start that process is to make it clear up front that like this is not the only thing we will ever say about our company. It is just like it is the kernel that everything else kind of flows from.
Yeah, I think when you have so many inputs, it's great to collect as many inputs as possible because a brand is the sum of all the experiences someone has with your company. So that's going to be way more than just what the brand marketing team is doing out in the world. Like it's everyone at the company is involved in creating this brand. So get all those people's inputs as well so they feel like they're part of it. And I think you'll start to see some different themes develop, like people may be using different words to describe a bigger idea, which is what brand experts are great at doing, is kind of collecting all these ideas and finding the similar themes and the similar language to use there. And I think one thing that's really that I found interesting, and I can use an example from Oyster, the international hiring company that Shannon and I worked at, is sometimes there can be some nuance in how people within the company interpret your brand. Mm-hmm. And it's great to collect those inputs, but then I think as brand leaders and content leaders, you kind of have to be like, actually, this is not us because it's going to take us down this path, or this is us and stay on this path. So for instance, like hiring internationally is great because at Oyster, the mission, the purpose, the values, all that was to expand opportunities to people who may not have opportunities for great jobs. And a different take on that some folks in the team were like curious about or maybe got confused on is like, oh, great, because I work through Oyster, we're helping people who get employed through Oyster. They can then go from their spot in the US and travel the world and still be employed at these great places. And like that is a very different brand vibe that you're communicating. It's like opportunity to great jobs from wherever you are in the world versus the freedom and flexibility to go wherever you want and travel and see the world. And those things are very different. So we were saying like, yes to this, no to this, and just having to be a bit more clear once you get those inputs in.
All right. So here's the next question. How much policing needs to be happening once people start putting this start executing it? Because it's one thing to say, here's, from an ethereal standpoint, here's what we're doing. And then once the rubber hits the road and the application starts to happen, how do you make sure everybody's on track?
Yeah, Kevin has a really nice reframing of brand policing. So and no brand cuffs over at Bonfire. But do you want to share that, Kevin?
Yeah, it's probably because I don't like telling people what to do, and so I reframe it from policing into shepherding. And so we want to be brand shepherds, not brand police with it. And the idea with shepherds, you're kind of just corralling and pointing people in the right direction rather than nitpicking and pointing out individual things. There may be a point in time where you do have to do the more tactical, specific little bits as you're reframing things for folks. But ideally, we as brand marketers are shepherds of it. The whole company can be thought of as shepherds as well in different ways. But it's more of a, I don't know, touchy-feely, holistic sense of we're all in this together rather than a police idea of like, where people might be afraid to touch the brand because they don't want to get it wrong. I think that's the sense that that's the line you want to balance there.
Yeah, I've used like a tiering system sometimes whenever I'm like responsible for reviewing or approving content, which is how evergreen is this thing? So
Mhm.
like how enduring is this impression going to be on the world? If it's a tweet, you know what? If it's off brand today, okay, like we're all going to live and go home and nobody's going to lose money over that. So, okay, fine. If it's, an ebook that we intend to promote for the next 6 months as a cornerstone of our campaign, if it's our company values that we're like rewriting or something, then like, yes, those things are quite important. And I think it is also having, as Kevin kind of mentioned, like this sort of open door policy of like, we are here to support you and to help your work be on brand. We're not here to go around like slapping wrists and telling people what to do. And I think that the more people feel empowered to use the brand and feel empowered to ask questions and ask for feedback, it's really more about relationship building than it is about process building at a certain point.
How much oversight are you having once everybody starts doing that in the very beginning, right? Because it seems like there has to be a little bit more hands-on just to make sure everybody's on track and shepherding instead of policing.
I think when you have these guidelines, there is a process of operationalizing and socializing anytime something is new like this. And so there's going to be, to your point, Tommy, like a bit more of an intense period where like, great, we're doing workshops once a week on this is the way to do things. I used to do a process called a brand parade, which is like one day a month or one day a week, maybe earlier. You go out and just look at everything that is out there in the brand. Anyone on the marketing team does it, and go and find examples of things that might feel a bit off, where we can have conversations around like, what do we think about this? What do we think about that? And so involving people both in the learning bit of it, but then also in the the discovery aspect to like bring stuff in that you have questions on, we can answer them together, is really helpful early on. And then ideally after that point, you have a couple of maybe brand champions within the team who know this stuff like the back of their hand, and they can be resources. And maybe there's one in the growth team, and there's one in the product marketing team, and there's obviously a bunch in the brand marketing team, but there's little embedded folks across the org that really care about this stuff and can help kind of further keep people and further shepherd people along the guidelines as time goes.
Yeah, and I think like strategy nesting as well. So like the overall brand strategy, for me at Oyster, I was running the content and brand team was kind of like a combined team at Oyster, and so we had a brand and editorial strategy, but then my PR and comms lead, her strategy laddered up directly to the brand strategy. Our like case studies and premium assets like demand gen content, his strategy laddered up to our larger brand and editorial strategy. And so they could point really clearly to like, these are the principles in the strategy that are filtering down that are most relevant for my kind of like derivative strategies. And so that just keeps everybody from the beginning kind of in lockstep, even if in execution, you then kind of have to like scooch things like one way or the other.
Let's talk about rebranding. What's that process look like? Because there's already foundations in place, but maybe those foundations have gotten stale. Maybe the market's changed. Maybe the narrative has changed, right? There's certainly, Buffer's a really great example of this, where you saw it grow up to a certain point, and then it was like, okay, now we're here. Now what? Because now we have a whole different group of customers. We have a much bigger team. There's a lot more voices going on here, and these expectations are a little bit different. What's that look like? Because I know there's some similarities, but not always.
Yeah, there's some, and I think you made a good point of like what is your reason for rebranding? To like, don't do it just because you're bored and because you want something fresh. Like there should be a major business reason for it. And so, for instance, at Buffer, it was because our persona changed. Like we went from kind of a solopreneur B2C to B persona to great, we want to go after SMBs and we want to go after direct to consumer businesses in particular. Like that focus, direct to consumer businesses care about certain things from the products that they choose. That needs to be reflected in the way that we do our brand identity, even in terms of like what we use for illustrations, what we use for visuals. I think what didn't change with Buffer was the values piece, like how we show up, our voice and tone, the things that we care about, and the way that we express ourselves as a brand.
We rebranded at Dashlane at the same time as doing a Super Bowl commercial. I do not recommend. I would recommend doing those things in completely separate decades if you can, and not literally in the same like 8-week time period. Just like a little professional advice. But no, I mean, to your point, like it isn't the same because there's a lot that is already at stake. And I think a really important question to ask is, where do you have equity in your existing brand?
Yeah.
So that you aren't throwing out something that is really important. You understand really well what is already working so that you can build on the strengths that you already have. And you can then kind of tack toward where you need to go. Like Kevin said, like maybe there's a compelling business reason, there's an audience shift, there's a market shift, whatever. But yeah, then you can tack to where you need to go without totally alienating, people who still love you for XYZ reasons, or like a core competency that you like weren't fully cognizant was a core competency until you kind of do this analysis. So I think understanding where you're starting is really, really important.
Yeah, I see a lot of, you see this with larger brands all the time where some of them are like, it's just time, right? Or you can tell that there's a new head of marketing that came in and he's like, nope, this is boring. And, it's interesting to me. I was part of a workshop once where they were talking about the difference between Pepsi and Coke, right? And of course, you always have the competing brands that are going against each other. And it was like, what does Coke stand for? I was like, oh, well, it's, all American, it's classic, it's da-da-da. And it's like, what does Pepsi stand for? And they're showing the different brand campaigns that they've done over the years. And you're like, I don't even know. So I think that's interesting, and going to the like, why are you doing it in the first place, and keeping those roots, I think it's really important. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, so we're gonna move on to the editing portion of the show. Before we do that, I'm gonna give the audience a quick pre-roll for our sponsor, Ahrefs, and we'll see you soon. While we wait for the edit, let me tell you a little bit about Ahrefs Webmaster Tools. Now, when I started the content studio, Ahrefs was the first tool that I bought, and this will give you a taste of why. There are two parts to Ahrefs Webmaster Tools: Site Audit and Site Explorer. Site Audit scans up to 5,000 pages per month and searches for over 100 predefined issues that could hurt your site's rankings. Once the audit's finished, you'll see your website's health score, a breakdown of the top issues, and how many URLs are affected. And if you need a refresher on what these issues are, they make it easy to see what it is and tell you how to fix it. To see which pages are affected by an issue, click on the number beside it, and you'll get a full list of URLs which you can then export and fix. They even made it easy to look at each category of issue with these super handy links in the sidebar. So if you want to see on-page issues, click over here, and now you've got a nice summarized report of things like word counts, title tags, and meta descriptions. You can also click on the Issues tab to see a list of issues labeled by importance so you can prioritize appropriately. The second part of Webmaster Tools is Site Explorer, which gives you a look into your backlink and search traffic data. Starting on Site Explorer's overview page, you can see top-level metrics for your website like domain rating, total backlinks, total referring domains, and the number of keywords your site ranks for, and your estimated search traffic. And right below that is an interactive graph that shows you how fast you're acquiring backlinks from unique websites, which is a good indicator of your site's popularity. In this report, you'll see useful things like the website and page authority metrics of the linking page, and the number of referring domains it has, the estimated search traffic to that page, and the context of the link, which is all super convenient. You can also use these handy filters to really drill in on the data you want to see. There's also the Organic Keywords report, which shows you all the keywords your website ranks for. You'll also see keyword metrics like search volume, keyword, and difficulty score. You can also see the top content on your site based on their popularity on these social networks. This only scratches the surface of what Webmaster Tools is capable of doing, and you can do this absolutely free. All you have to do is go to ahrefs.com/AWT and verify your site within just a few clicks. All right, let's jump back into the edit. And we're back. Thanks so much, everybody, for checking out the Ahrefs ad. Again, I am very excited to have them as a sponsor. Check them out when you get the chance. Absolutely, Webmaster Tools, totally free and worth the download. All right, we're back into the edit. I would love to hear your first impressions before we get into the piece. The piece is, what is a brand voice, plus 7 tips to develop one. First impressions, Shannon, go.
A lot of this is like was my bread and butter at Siegel and Gale. Like I made brand voices for like 2.5 years. Like that was kind of what I did. And so my first impression was this was like a flashback. It was like a trip down memory lane. And I was like, wow, okay, this was very much 2015, like all over again for me. Yeah.
Awesome. Kevin?
Yeah, I think it was this interesting journey for me as I was reading of like, what is this blog post trying to accomplish? And so first impression was just like, how do I ground myself in, is this a giant guide? Is this a quick explainer? Is this a bunch of examples? Is this like, what are we trying to do here? And so that was my my existential journey as I was reading through. And you know,
That's always my favorite initial feedback. I've heard that before. What are we trying to do here? Who is this for? What's going on? Now, before we like dive into the piece, I actually would love to get your thoughts on the pre-work that needs to happen to figure out who is this for, what are we doing here, all of that, because I think that's one of the most critical things, and I think it's something that a lot of us can miss in the actual down and dirty creation process.
Yeah, I would really want to define who is the marketer that you are targeting with this,
Mm-hmm.
and what would you like them to do? I mean, this is very basic, and what would you like them to do when they're done? Because to me, and like not to jump too deep into it, there was a lot of like altitude shifting of the understanding that the piece assumes the audience had.
Mm-hmm.
So we're moving from some like really, really basic definitions of things into stuff that I would say is like kind of nuanced and tactical.
Mm-hmm.
And so who is the who is finding this useful? Because like I think like maybe 4 different people could find different things useful from this piece. And would it be a stronger piece if we just said, okay, well, actually the audience is a senior marketing leader who has never run a brand team before
Mm-hmm.
and now needs to, something like that, which would maybe like ground and center this advice in a way that was missing a bit.
It's that whole adage of when it's for everybody, it's for nobody.
For nobody.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite right.
Okay, Kevin, you put in a whole lot of alternative headlines here. What is the rationale, I suppose, because I think we're talking about framing, right? How are we going to frame the piece? But what's the rationale for the different headlines we've got going on here?
oh boy, we could spend hours just talking about my headline neuroses with things. Shannon and I were having this conversation the other day. I tend to be a bit more of an overseller with things. And so if I can come up with like a headline that I think you're going to click on, great. Then I'll go figure out how to make the article work like from there. And so part of it is like the headline gets me excited to write the thing. It gets me to feel like if I can make this thing a reality, then the people are going to read it. People are going to find value in it. So there's a bit of like showmanship maybe with headlines for me in a sense of like, this is the thing I think is going to work. Let's go figure out how to make it happen.
Yeah.
But I also think there is that framing to it also. Like if you come at a post calling it the ultimate guide to brand voice, you expect a certain thing as a reader of what that's going to be like. If you think of the like reader UX as a phrase that I often think about when I'm editing, it's like, what is this user experience, the reader experience supposed to be like? So if you frame it as a complete guide, that's one thing. If you open it as like, what is brand voice? That could be a 200 word article or a 2000, like it's a very open-ended. If you're talking about like, this is going to be full of examples, like whatever that expectation is, you set that in the headline. And so I wrote a bunch in the document of like, these are different directions you could take it. those will then dictate how you build the rest. And then I often spend so much time on the headline also because like that is the thing that people are going to read first, or they're at least going to skim, or it's almost like a subject line in a way. Like if you don't get the subject line right, if you don't get the headline right, the rest of it isn't as important. And so I tend to spend probably too much time on like the headline and the intro. But I just think it's so important for framing and for actually getting people to keep going throughout the article.
I don't think there's such thing as too much time on it. I've been doing a lot more studying of YouTube lately, and a lot of the larger YouTube creators will say if they don't have a thumbnail and a title in advance, then they're not doing the video because they need to know how to package it first. And something that I've been thinking about a lot more lately as I'm about to develop the blog aspect of the content studio is what is this going to look like in somebody's social media feed, right? Like what's that header image going to look like? What's that subject line or the title going to be? And again, it's packaging because that's how you get people to click. Without that, you can't deliver on any premise. So, all right, let's move forward. Shannon, you already said here, feels like the altitude is all over the place. Like to see the headline in the doc. All right, overplayed. This is my favorite right here. Give me an example.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about the very opening line. We start getting into it. When you think, no, I love this. When you think about how your favorite brand communicates, what comes to mind? Is the brand funny, inspirational? Yeah.
I'm done with questions. I'm done with questions as like the opener. It's also the dictionary defines X as blah blah for the opening of the blog post. Like it's fine. Like it works. Like I get it. Like it's a way to get people in the mindset, but it's very expected. And also you're asking me to do work in the very first sentence instead of you give me an example of like really inspirational or funny or exciting or like out of the box brand voice or brand content that like everybody would know or that maybe I've never heard of before, and then it's exciting and it's intriguing in that way. So yeah, I just think so like cliches are cliches for a reason because they work, but you can ditch it.
It's interesting that you have a show don't tell situation a little bit later on down the road, and this very introduction, right? This first line, paragraph, opening, actually, a lot of it, I removed some links from here, right? So you can't really tell who it is from the very beginning, but we're talking about branding.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like there might be a little bit of dissonance there from the very beginning, yeah?
Yeah, I think, and maybe this is getting into the comment that you're referencing, but like, how about a super voicey piece on brand voice?
Yeah.
Like, that would be really exciting to show me how it can come to life in even a pretty informational article like this. And so, I wouldn't say that there's much that's distinct about this writing compared to probably like a lot of B2B blog writing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, show me how it's done.
All right, Kevin, one of your favorite editing techniques is to entirely cut the first paragraph. I usually say something like this too. Cut the first 500 lines are not necessary. Tell me a little bit about like where's your head at on that?
Yeah, like get to the good stuff. Like I think I mean, this will reveal maybe how poor my writing process is, but I will usually just write something and be like, okay, I got other stuff to do, like pass it off to someone else. Like is my first pass going to be, pass it off to Shannon. Like, is my first pass going to be perfect? No. Am I going to like meander for a long time until I actually figure out what I'm trying to say? Yes. And typically I will leave the meandering in at the top because I don't have time to go back into it, or because I think it sounded good. Like oftentimes like the stuff that like kill your darlings, I often put my darlings at the top because I think they're going to sound really great. I'll meander into the topic. You can just chop off the first part. So I think it helps me to be like, no, it's not that the first part is bad and the first part isn't like catchy or good writing. It's just like, it's just not necessary. And to call it a rule that I have is also helpful because then it's like no hard feelings.
Yeah.
That's the rule. It's got to go.
That's I say it's the author clearing their throat is ultimately what that is.
Love that.
And the audience has heard me mention this stat a bunch of times, but I'm kind of nerdy about the experience, right? The relationship between user and screen. The average American adult reads nonfiction at a rate of 238 words per minute. So, what's intuitive to say cut the first however many words, it's usually because you've already spent a minute wasting time trying to get to the good stuff. So, yeah, in case you wanted a little stat there for you.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, so you said what brand is writing this? Voice is pretty generic. Yep, we talked about this. Oh, okay, so clunky sentences, right? I like this. The sentence is a bit clunky. Subject, phrase, verb, object agreements. Tell me about clunky sentences in general, because I know that we can see that quite a bit in the content space overall.
Yeah. I might have written that comment, and I think it sounds clunky to me. I think Shannon will probably know like the actual reasons why it's clunky in terms of like, I don't even know the right parts of speech that I'm identifying here, but I think sometimes when you're reading through those things, like I will lose track of what are we actually tying this back to. So like, what are we saying is like a subject verb agreement, for instance, when you stick phrases in there, like the thing you end up talking about at the end of the sentence is actually different than the thing you talk about at the first of the sentence. And sometimes allegedly you're probably supposed to be able to identify this when you read your stuff out loud before you hit publish. I've never read a single blog post I've written out loud before I've hit publish, so I don't know if that's like something people do or not. And so it's maybe more so like, did you get other eyes on it, other perspectives on it to be able to catch these things, which I think is more my MO. Or just like, did you go back and read it multiple times with an eye toward clarity and legibility? And so that's where I tend to notice like these things don't quite line up from a structure perspective.
I hate that advice of write like you speak, because that's, I think the medium always is supposed to dictate how the message is delivered. So, all right, cool. Moving forward here, you prefer the stat here that talks about the impact of brand voice rather than a stat that talks about marketers. So statistics are really interesting. It's actually kind of a hot topic on the show. Some people say that leading with a stat can diminish your own voice, because they'll lead with the stat to support what they're saying instead of saying what they're saying and then supporting with the stat. What's your take on that? And more importantly, what we're talking about here is stat selection.
Yeah, I think there's a literacy with statistics that can be a bit iffy sometimes in B2B writing and SaaS writing, where it's like, oh, we need a proof point, we need a statistic, without actually thinking through like does the statistic make sense? And so in the example here, the statistic is talking about what marketers believe is true about the impact of brand voice rather than actual stat of the actual impact of brand voice. But I've also seen it where like the methodology behind the stat is not accurate, or the link is to something that is like 7 years old and is like buried within other links, and there's actually not a source to this thing over time. And so I think we can get a bit greedy and blind about the stats that we just stick in there too. And so I typically, whenever I see a stat, I try to think about like, where did this come from? What is it actually saying? And like, how accurate is it in context to the overall story we're trying to tell? I love stats, but I think there's a bit of rigor that needs to happen with them.
Yeah. Shannon, do you have any thoughts on that? I have some thoughts I want to throw in there, but you're the guest.
No, please go ahead.
So when I was at CXL, right, we had a very stat heavy blog, right? It was very much like, this research, this study, because we're looking at behavioral research and how that plays into conversion optimization and whatnot. And my own policy around stats was to say, here's this thing that you feel, right? This is the thing that you know is happening intuitively. Now, let me throw out a statistic that validates what it is that you're feeling, instead of saying, here's a stat to make you just keep going on and maybe prove that I have a little bit of a research there. And I feel like that's probably a more appropriate way to use statistics, because we're not just trying to say, hey, here's a bunch of people who said a bunch of things. You can get stat blind, right? 88% of marketers believe that brand language. Okay, sure. Now what?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Great.
I think the trouble that I often fall into is like, I will think of a point and be like, oh, that sounds like a good opinion. Let me go find something that like validates that opinion that I have, which is also dangerous and not good. That's like, I don't know, confirmation bias or something. There's some fallacy about that. And so I think that's another trap to fall into also. It's like, here's a bunch of stuff I want to say. Let me go find the stats that support this opinion that I have without, thinking more holistically about those things.
Yeah. And to that point too, it's really easy to manipulate those stats if you want to go with the confirmation bias, because it's like 1 out of 4 marketers believe that brand voice is important, right? Or 3 out of 4 agree that it's not, right? So it's like, how can you manipulate that if you're gonna start moving that around? Now, right here, in fact, 88% of marketers believe that brand language helps their brand connect with customers. Are we conflating brand voice? Tell me the difference between the two, because that's actually critical to the overall piece.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure what they meant by brand language. And, if I'm kind of busy and I'm not going to click on that hyperlink to where that stat comes from to bother to find out what brand language actually is. I mean, is brand language just proprietary terms and kind of terms of art and jargon that are like associated with your brand or your industry? Or does brand language mean an expression of your company's brand voice? So it just was inexact to a point where I started getting confused about what we were talking about. And I think that was a bit of something that plagued this piece throughout, was like a conflation of voice, messaging, some tone stuff. It all just kind of felt a little soggy, like at certain points. Wasn't sure exactly what they meant.
Getting confused 8 lines in is probably not a good thing.
Usually no.
No. Okay, so what is a brand? Why is this here? Why is this here? Should it be a heading? Is it way too short of a... Tell me a little bit about that, right? So why is this here? I'm going to assume that it's there to hit the featured snippet in Google. Right?
Fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I ask why it's here? Was that me?
Yeah, that was you.
Yes. Okay, so a bit about like my feedback process also is like, in the way I gave feedback here is like off the top of my head, let me just get it all down on paper. When I'm giving feedback to like a teammate or someone who I know is going to read this, who may have contributed to creating or writing it, I will add a lot more words that are not quite so direct and like questioning things. And so that's like a little insight into my editing style, I guess. The question, why is it here? I think that's part of like what is this article trying to accomplish piece? Like, are we trying to hit every single bit of brand strategy and define all the different aspects of it in this article? Are we really going to unpack like what is brand in such a short little piece here when it is such a big topic? Maybe there were some links in there that I missed that maybe they link out to other things. I think that's a great like hub and spoke strategy too. But just to give it like such a small little snippet in there in context to this much larger piece, I think is just a little scary to me. I think what could have made sense is if we were to say like, where does brand voice fit within everything you do as a brand? And then here's a list of different things that you might consider, like brand personality, stories, narratives, brand positioning, product positioning, like all these different elements. Link out to all those different articles you've written, but place it into context rather than just kind of giving lip service to this really big idea of what is brand.
Yeah, that's where I started getting a little fuzzy on like, who doesn't know what a brand is, but is trying to create a brand voice. And so that's why I wasn't sure the altitude.
Well, and this is an interesting bit here, right? You disagree also with the premise of the piece. I do. So we're a couple paragraphs in here, right? We're in the second paragraph essentially, and what is this setting you up to believe as you're getting into the piece a little bit further, especially as somebody who might stumble upon this, right? If you're a person who's in that like mid-career stage and you're coming across this for inspiration, maybe.
Yeah. I think both Kevin and I would say that this is a bit too narrow of a definition of brand, and that brand is actually about the experience that your customers have with everything that you do. It's kind of the sum total of how they feel and experience you as a company across touch points, across time. And so I think this makes it a lot shallower than it actually is, and kind of short changes the scope of what you're really trying to do here.
Yeah. Where it's the signposting of what the rest of the piece is going to be about, and then as we get a little bit further, and we're starting to run up on time here. Pardon me. We're starting to get to this point where, okay, what is a brand voice? What's the difference between a brand's voice and tone? We start to go down. Why is it important? Right? Is there anything in here that stands out before we start to get a little bit further into it? What was some of the pieces where you're like, oh man?
Yeah, I think for me it was like the overall hierarchy of the piece
Yeah.
felt a little flip-flopped. And so, the difference between voice and tone is, at least for what I understand the purposes of this article to be, maybe more nuanced, or that's like a follow-up article to what this article is. And we're already getting into that before we even talk about why it's important. So if I'm someone who needs to be sold on the concept of why having a brand voice is worth investing in and is going to be impactful for my brand and for my organization, and I'm not getting that until, page 2.5 or 3, but I already know what a tone is, then, I think I just needed a little bit more, like the hierarchy of importance just felt off to me. And I think Kevin pointed out later that there's examples kind of like shoved in the middle before tactics for creating the voice. And so the order just felt off to me.
Let's zoom out just a little bit and talk about structure in general. How are you going about finding the appropriate structure for something like this?
Yeah. I mean, I think just speaking for myself, it's like, what question would I ask first? So like, what is the first question I have about this topic? And maybe it is, what is a brand voice, period? And then the second, like I try to put myself in I try to define an audience, then I try to put myself in the shoes of that audience, which is, okay, now that I know what it is, why is this thing important? Okay, that I know that it's important, how do I do it? Okay, great. Now that I know how to do it, show me some examples so that I can do it better. And so I think it's just trying to, I used to have a Post-it note when we were working at Oyster. I had a Post-it note on my computer monitor that said, "You know too much." And that was like a really good reminder to me that as a communicator for the brand, I am not communicating with myself. I am not communicating with my colleagues who know everything there is to know about our brand and about our company and about our business and what we do. So remembering that, like, I know too much, don't write for me, was really helpful. And so I think it's having that attitude when you start planning out your piece.
Yeah. Kevin,
I think there's something very something very beautiful and generous in that approach to things too. Like one of the things that we did when I was at Buffer was you just keep answering people questions until there are no more questions that can be answered. And you end up with like a 5,000 word blog post. It's fine, those things do well on SEO, but they're also like a very generous gift to give someone. And so if someone's coming to this article thinking about brand voice, then yeah, it's exactly that sequence of questions that Shannon asked. Like, what is it? Cool. How do I do this thing? Cool. How do I go deeper into this thing? What are some examples of this? And just making sure you're answering all those questions in that order, I think will give the perfect structure to something like that.
I'm going to also propose that structurally speaking, right, Shannon, you're talking about asking the right questions and then the order that they should be asked. Structurally speaking, I think a good part of that also comes down to author engagement with the subject matter itself, right? If I'm just trying to hit section by section to fill it out so I have, the appropriate word count and I'm hitting the right keywords and the engagement with the piece it becomes a little lifeless in some ways, but then also the structure of it, you're not having that logical flow. So even when you read it back, you're going, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Where if you don't have any level of engagement with the piece and you're just going through the motions, that becomes very different. And we are going to wrap it up here pretty soon, but I do want to say, I think what both of you write is very engaged overall. And I would actually love to get your thoughts on how do you stay engaged with the piece? How do you stay engaged with the brand? And how do you end up not going through the motions once you have all of this stuff in place to keep it fresh all along? And then we'll close everything out.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've tried to orchestrate my career, and especially now with Bonfire and being a co-founder and, you know, writing for our newsletter and writing for our clients. Like I think I've tried very deliberately to write about things that I actually care about. And I think that that's hard. That's a privilege, and not everybody has the privilege to be writing about something that they like personally feel passionate about or engaged by, or like, you know, their intellectual or creative juices like start flowing when they think about a topic. But I've been very deliberate about that. And so maybe kind of a cheating answer, but like that's how I stay engaged. Just I actually have a lot of things to say on these topics, and I want to communicate them from my point of view. And I'm a loud person, so that's, so I want to be heard.
That works.
Yeah. Well, I think something else that Shannon is curious too. I think maybe she and I share that in common. And so, you know, when there are cases where we might not have a topic that is super interesting to us, we can at least fall back on our curiosity for something. Like if we're working with, like when we were in revenue tech, like I didn't really care about revenue tech super deeply, but was curious to be like, well, what do people in this space care about, and why do they care about it, and how do we understand them better, understand these topics better? And so I think there's an element of curiosity that will see you through stages where maybe you're not working at the place that brings you most to life.
I love that. I love that. And I think if we were to scale that out to like freelancers and to other team members, it's really important to embrace a culture of curiosity, and leaders really also should be doing the same thing, not forcing people to stay curious, but encouraging people to stay curious, because that's what makes the whole thing interesting and even more fun to show up at the end of the day. So cool.
Yeah. And speaking of editing, like I think there's a way to show curiosity even in the editing process where it's less about like, here is all my answers to all these things. It's more about like, what were you thinking about when you were making these decisions? What were you exploring? What were you going through? Making that more of a conversation is one way to like lead by example, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've seen a lot of editors who are also just going through the motions, and then it goes out to market and they're like, how come we're not performing as well as we want? We're not getting return. And it's like, if you're not the person staying curious as the editor, the front lines, the first person to see it all, you're the one responsible ultimately for keeping the authors engaged in that process. So cool. Yeah, we're going to wrap it up. So, but thank you two for so much for coming on. This was a great conversation. If you would like to have access to the article, go to thecontentstudio.com/studio insider. Our studio insiders get access to all of the articles as well as exclusive bonuses. And there's all sorts of cool stuff. Again, shout out to our sponsor, Ahrefs. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out, and have a great rest of the day.